permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on our plans for leaving the European Union. Today, the fifth round of negotiations begins in Brussels, and this government is getting on with the job of delivering the democratic will of the British people. As I set out in my speech in Florence, we want to take a creative and pragmatic approach to securing a new, deep and special partnership with the European Union, which spans both a new economic relationship and a new security relationship. So let me set out what each of these relationships could look like before turning to how we get there. Mr. Speaker, I have been clear that when we leave the European Union, we will no longer be members of its single market or its customs union. The British people voted for control of their borders, their laws and their money, and that is what this government is going to deliver. At the same time, we want to find a creative solution to a new economic relationship.
Order. Members must calm themselves. A little harsh. The honourable gentleman member for Southwark and Bermondsey has had something for breakfast which I counselled colleagues to avoid. Prime Minister.
At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we want to find a creative solution to a new economic relationship that can support prosperity for all our peoples. We do not want to settle for adopting a model enjoyed by other countries. So if we have rejected the idea of something based on European Economic Area membership, for this would mean having to adopt automatically and in their entirety new EU rules over which in future we will have little influence and no vote. Neither are we seeking a Canadian-style free trade agreement, for compared with what exists today, this would represent such a restriction on our mutual market access that it would benefit none of our economies. Instead, I'm proposing a unique and ambitious economic partnership. It will reflect our unprecedented position of starting with the same rules and regulations. We will maintain our unequivocal commitment to free trade and high standards, and we will need a framework to manage where we continue to align and when we choose to differ. There will be areas of policy and regulation which are outside the scope of our trade and economic relations where this should be straightforward. There will be areas which do affect our economic relations, where we and our European friends may have different goals, or where we share the same goals but want to achieve them through different means. And there will be areas where we want to achieve the same goals in the same ways because it makes sense for our economies. And because rights and obligations must be held in balance, the decisions we both take will have consequences for the UK's access to the EU market and EU access to our market. But this dynamic, creative and unique economic partnership will enable the UK and the EU to work side by side in bringing shared prosperity to our peoples. Let me turn now to the new security relationship. As I said when I visited our troops, when I visited our troops serving on the NATO mission in Estonia last month, the United Kingdom is unconditionally committed to maintaining Europe's security. And we will continue to offer aid and assistance to EU member states that are the victims of armed aggression, terrorism and natural or man-made disasters. So we are proposing a bold new strategic agreement that provides a comprehensive framework for future security, law enforcement and criminal justice cooperation, a treaty between the UK and the EU. We're also proposing a far-reaching partnership on how together we protect Europe from the threats we face in the world today. So this partnership will be unprecedented in its breadth and depth, taking in cooperation on diplomacy, defence and security and development. So let me turn to how we build a bridge from where we are now to the new relationship that we want to see. When we leave the European Union on the 29th of March 2019, neither the UK nor the EU and its member states will be in a position to implement smoothly many of the detailed arrangements that will underpin this new relationship we seek. Businesses will need time to adjust and governments will need to put new systems in place, and businesses want certainty about the position in the interim. That's why I suggested in my speech at Lancaster House there should be a period of implementation, and why I proposed such a period in my speech in Florence last month. During this strictly time-limited period, we will have left the EU and its institutions, but we are proposing that for this period, access to one another's market should continue on current terms, and Britain also should continue to take part in existing security measures. The framework for this period, which can be agreed under Article 50, would be the existing structure of EU rules and regulations. Now, I know that some people may have some concerns about this, but there are two reasons why it makes sense. First, we want our departure from the EU to be as smooth as possible. It wouldn't make sense to make people and businesses plan for two sets of changes in the relationship between the UK and the EU. Second, we should concentrate on negotiating time and capital on what really matters, the future long-term relationship we will have with the EU after this temporary period ends. During the implementation period, people will continue to be able to come and live and work in the UK, but there will be a registration system, an essential preparation for the new immigration system required to retake control of our borders. And our intention is that new arrivals will be subject to new rules for EU citizens on long-term settlement. We will also push forward on our future independent trade policy, talking to trading partners across the globe and preparing to introduce those deals once this period is over. How long the period should be is determined simply by how long it will take to prepare and implement the new systems we need. And as of today, these considerations point to an implementation period of around 2 years. As I said in Florence, because I don't believe that either the EU or the British people will want us to stay longer in the existing structures than necessary, we could also agree to bring forward aspects of that future framework, such as new dispute resolution mechanisms, more quickly if this can be done smoothly. At the heart of these arrangements, there should be a double lock, guaranteeing a period of implementation giving businesses and people the certainty they will be able to prepare for the change, and guaranteeing this implementation period will be time-limited, giving everyone the certainty this will not go on forever. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Florence speech was to move the negotiations forward, and that is exactly what has happened. As Michel Barnier said after the last round, there is a new dynamic in the negotiations, and I want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, for all he has done to drive through real and tangible progress on a number of vital areas. On citizens' rights, as I've said many times, this government greatly values the contribution of all EU citizens who've made their lives in our country. We want them to stay. In Florence, I gave further commitments that the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU will not diverge over time, committing to incorporate our agreement on citizens' rights fully into UK law and making sure the UK courts can refer directly to it. Since Florence, there has been more progress, including reaching agreement on reciprocal healthcare and pensions, and encouraging further alignment on a range of important social security rights. So I hope our negotiating teams can now reach full agreement quickly. On Northern Ireland, we have now begun drafting joint principles on preserving the common travel area and associated rights. And we have both stated explicitly we will not accept any physical infrastructure at the border. We owe it to the people of Northern Ireland, and indeed to everyone on the island of Ireland, to get this right. Then there is the question of the EU budget. As I've said, this can only be resolved as part of the settlement of all the issues that we are working through. Still, I do not want our partners to fear that they will need to pay more or receive less over the remainder of the current budget plan as a result of our decision to leave. The UK will honour commitments we have made during the period of our membership. And as we move forwards, we will also want to continue working together in ways that promote the long-term economic development of our continent. This includes continuing to take part in those specific policies and programmes which are greatly to our joint advantage, such as those that promote science, education and culture, and those that promote our mutual security. And as I set out in my speech at Lancaster House, in doing so, we would want to make a contribution to cover our fair share of the costs involved. Mr. Speaker, I continued discussions on many of these issues when I met with European leaders in Tallinn at the end of last month. And in the bilateral discussions I've had with Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Szydło, President Tusk and the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, they welcomed the tone set in Florence and the impact this was having on moving the negotiations forwards. Preparing for life outside the EU is also about the legislative steps we take. Our EU withdrawal bill will shortly enter committee stage, carrying over EU rules and regulations into our domestic law from the moment we leave the EU. And today, we are publishing 2 white papers on trade and customs. These pave the way for legislation to allow the UK to operate as an independent trading nation and to create an innovative customs system that will help us achieve the greatest possible tariff and barrier-free trade as we leave the EU. And while I believe it is profoundly in all our interests for the negotiations to succeed, it is also our responsibility as a government to prepare for every eventuality. So that is exactly what we are doing. These white papers also support that work, including setting out steps to minimise disruption for businesses and travellers. Mr. Speaker, a new deep and special partnership between a sovereign United Kingdom and a strong and successful European Union is our ambition and our offer to our European friends. Achieving that partnership will require leadership and flexibility, not just from us, but from our friends, the 27 nations of the EU. And as we look forward to the next stage, the ball is in their court, but I'm optimistic it will receive a positive response. Because what we are seeking is not just the best possible deal for us, but I believe that will also be the best possible deal for our European friends too. So while of course progress will not always be smooth, by approaching these negotiations in a constructive way, in a spirit of friendship and cooperation, and with our sights firmly set on the future, I believe we can prove the doomsayers wrong. And I believe we can seize the opportunities of this defining moment in the history of our nation. Mr. Speaker, a lot of the day-to-day coverage is about process. But this, on the other hand, is vitally important. I am determined to deliver what the British people voted for and to get it right. That is my duty as Prime Minister. It is our duty as a government, and it is what we will do. And I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the Prime Minister for the advanced copy of the statement. 16 months on from the referendum, no real progress has been made. The Prime Minister delivered yet another definitive speech, designed to herald a breakthrough, which instead only confirmed the confusion at the heart of government. Mr. Speaker, if we want to judge the progress the government has made since triggering Article 50, we shouldn't just look at the latest Florence speech. We should also look back at the Prime Minister's last big Brexit speech in January, where she outlined 12 objectives for Brexit negotiations. And, Mr. Speaker, how many of those objectives has the government met 10 months down the line? The answer, none. The Florence speech, in fact, demonstrated the scale of the mess the government is making of these negotiations. 15 months on from the referendum, we're still no clearer what the future of this country will look like. The question must be asked, what on earth has the government been doing all this time? Calling an election in which voters refused to give the Prime Minister the mandate she wanted. Since then, Cabinet ministers have been squabbling amongst themselves all that time. 15 months wasted. I'm sure the Prime Minister wanted her speech in Florence to bring life to these critical negotiations. On the substance of the speech itself, I'm pleased that the Prime Minister has taken Labour's lead and accepted accepted the need for transition as we leave the EU. However, Mr. Speaker, it is still unclear what the Prime Minister envisages for a transitional period, or how long it will last. The Prime Minister said the implementation period would last around 2 years, yet the Foreign Secretary interprets that as 2 years and not a second more, while the Chancellor hints it might be more. He's here, he could correct us on this. She told us during a transition, access to one another's markets should continue on current terms. Yet, at the Conservative Party conference, the Secretary of State for International Trade contradicted this and said, "We will leave the single market and the customs union at the end of March 2019. The Immigration Minister told his party conference that freedom of movement will end as we know it in March 2019. So how does this square with the Prime Minister's assertion that we continue on current terms during the transition? It can't be both. Can the Prime Minister clear up the confusion and tell the House exactly what her implementation period means in terms of the single market, customs union and freedom of movement? Mr. Speaker, on the financial settlement with the EU, the Prime Minister has offered to commit funds to ensure no EU member state has to pay more into the EU budget until the end of the current framework. We welcome this as a sensible offer. However, can the Prime Minister confirm whether the UK will be willing to pay money to the EU post-transition to access programmes which benefit this country? It's an important issue for many parts of Britain. On the issue of citizens' rights, the Prime Minister says this is an area where progress has been made with the EU. I'm sure that many colleagues in this House will testify to the level of concern and indeed desperation of many of our constituents who come to our surgeries across the country in fear that families and friendships will soon be ripped apart. So, Mr. Speaker, no, it's not scaremongering, Mr. Speaker. This is a serious issue. This is a serious issue that affects many people in this country, day in, day out, who are frankly frightened of the future. So, Mr. Speaker, I call on the Prime Minister again today, listen to the TUC and the CBI and unilaterally guarantee the rights of EU nationals living in the UK. Given, Mr. Speaker, that this House voted in July 2016 to unilaterally guarantee the rights of EU citizens, can the Prime Minister finally reflect the will of the House and give people and businesses the assurances they need? On Northern Ireland, we welcome the drafting of joint principles, but 15 months on from the referendum, we should be beyond platitudes and negotiating the practicalities. Yep. Mr. Speaker, the speech in Florence was supposed to put momentum into the Brexit negotiations. It is staggering. It is staggering, Mr. Speaker, that after...
there was a lot of noise when the Prime Minister began her statement, and I indicated that people should calm down, and the same applies now. The Right Honourable Gentleman will be heard. He will be heard with courtesy, and he will be heard in full. Jeremy Corbyn.
It is staggering that after 8 months since triggering Article 50, the government has made so little progress. The Secretary of State for International Trade said a deal with the EU should be the easiest in human history. That's what he said. Now the reality for this Tory government is beginning to bite. But if things do not improve, the reality may soon begin to bite for the jobs and living standards of the people of this country. These negotiations are the most important in Britain's recent history, vital to our future and vital to our economy. Just at the moment when Britain needs a strong negotiating team, we have a cabinet at each other's throats. Half of the Conservative Party want the Foreign Secretary sacked. The other half want the Chancellor sacked.
We want both of them sacked.
Mr. Speaker.
Order! I say to the honourable gentleman, the member for Braintree, that I'm advised that he is being groomed for statesmanship. And I say to the aspiring statesman, it is in the circumstances impolitic at best and rude at worst for him to point. I am trying to help the honourable gentleman. Jeremy Corbyn.
Rather than fighting over their own jobs, the reality is that millions of people's jobs and living standards depend on the success of these negotiations. If this government can't negotiate a deal for Britain, they should make way for a team that can.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman talks about what has happened over the last 15 months. Well, I'll tell him what has happened. This government has triggered Article 50 and is negotiating the leaving of the European Union. And we are negotiating the practical details that need to be in place to ensure that we first of all get the best possible deal for the UK, and that secondly, that we get a deal where the withdrawal is as smooth and orderly as possible. Now, he talks about a number of these issues. He says that the Florence speech was due to give momentum to the talks. Indeed, it has given momentum to the talks. But I happily say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the last thing we need in these talks is his momentum. He said, will we leave the single market and the customs union in March 2019? Yes, and I have said that we will. He says, will freedom of movement as we know it end? And I have said yes, and I've set out in the statement I made today, if he'd read it, the point about the difference that will come in during that period. He talked about citizens' rights. There is considerable agreement between us and the European Union on this issue. There are some remaining issues to be dealt with. I've been very clear at every stage that we want EU citizens in this country to stay. We welcome the contribution that they have made. But I'm also clear that we want UK citizens in the 27 member states of the European Union to be given their rights too. And everybody in this House of Commons should have a care for UK citizens as well as for EU citizens. And then finally, he says that this is a historic moment. It is indeed an important moment for this country. This is a very important and significant set of negotiations that will set this country's future for generations to come. I'm optimistic and ambitious about what we can achieve for our country. He said we need to negotiate carefully. Yes, we do. That's why the Article 50 letter reflected the principles I'd set out in the Lancaster House speech, and the Florence speech updates that and reflects again the principles of the Lancaster House speech. What a contrast with the Labour Party, which said that they would respect the result of the referendum, then voted against the withdrawal bill. They said they wanted to leave the single market. Now they say they might stay in the single market. They said that staying in the customs union was deeply unattractive. Now they want to stay in the customs union forever. And they used to be against a second referendum, but now they've refused to rule it out. With such a confused position on Brexit, no wonder they say there'll be a run on the pound if Labour get into power.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister reassure me that the statement clarifies that it's not the government's policy on the one hand, to seek to remove all trading barriers with countries like Japan and the United States, but on the other hand, to seek to create new regulatory, customs and tariff barriers with the European Union, which at the moment we have free trade and which is our largest trading partner in the world. And if that is correct, and that is consistent perhaps with what she's just said, as she recalls no doubt that ultra-Brexiteers, including the present Foreign Secretary, assured citizens during the referendum campaign that no difference at all would take place in our trading relationships with Europe because they needed to sell us their Mercedes and their Prosecco, then would it not be best to proceed with the negotiations on the basis that our ideal solution would be to stay in the single market and the customs union, and she can then seek to negotiate changes to those conditions presently attached to that, which are the things to which she refers when she tries to explain where she is at the moment.
Well, my right honourable and learned friend has always been consistent on this particular issue of membership of the European Union. When people voted in the referendum and voted for the UK to leave the European Union, I think they were voting for us to take control of our borders, our laws and our money. If we were to remain full members of the customs union and the single market, that would bring with it continuing jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice into the future forever. It would also bring with it the requirement for free movement. What I have set out in the Florence speech and the offer that we have made to the European Union is what I've described previously as a deep and special partnership with the EU. And my right honourable friend and learned friend is right. We do want to ensure that the trading relationship we have with the European Union can be as tariff-free and as frictionless as possible. But we also see advantage in being able to negotiate new trading agreements around the rest of the world as well. I think that is to the advantage of the United Kingdom, and that's what the government will be pursuing.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of her statement. Although I must say that a statement that took 13 minutes to deliver, and not one mention of the devolved administrations. That's the lack of respect that we see from this government in London. And let me...
Order. It is a considerable discourtesy, I say to the Honourable Gentleman of North West Leicestershire, to walk out of the chamber past the member who's on his feet in the middle of his attempted intervention. It is a point that is so blindingly obvious that it shouldn't need to be notified to the Honourable Gentleman. But as he wasn't apparently aware of the discourtesy involved, he now is. And when the House has settled down, perhaps we can hear the leader of the Scottish National Party, order, who I remind the House must be heard, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, we respect the fact that the UK has voted to come out of Europe. But we were told in our referendum in 2014 that if we stayed within the UK, then our future in Europe would be preserved. And we have the situation today that Scotland has voted to remain, and in particular wants to stay in the single market and the customs union. It's about time that we got some respect from the government. Mr. Speaker, the situation is now critical. Can I say to honourable gentlemen, I can hear them chuntering. If they want to catch the Speaker's eye, they're entitled to do so, but perhaps they may show a little bit of respect. These are important matters, and the public are watching this behaviour. Mr. Speaker, we stand on the brink of being dragged out of the European Union with no deal in place and no automatic introduction of WTO rules. A catastrophe for Scotland, threatening up to 80,000 jobs in our country alone. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is the President of the European Commission has said that a miracle needs to happen for there to be any progress in these negotiations. Meanwhile, the European Parliament voted last week to stop negotiations moving on to the next phase, citing lack of progress. Mr. Speaker, the clock is running against the Prime Minister in more ways than one. On EU citizens' rights, this government continues to drag its heels. There must now be from the Prime Minister a universal declaration a universal declaration that EU citizens in the UK can have their current citizen and rights protected after exit day. No ifs, no buts, do it today. I urge the Prime Minister to listen to the voices of the devolved administration. We will not accept this legislation as it stands. A complete violation of the Scotland Act and biggest power grab since devolution. Indeed, just last week, the author of Article 50, Lord Kerr, said that Westminster is trying to break the founding principle of the devolution settlement. The SNP has set out 3 key tests on Brexit for this government. 1, as an absolute minimum, we want continued membership of the single market and the customs union. 2, declare now without delay that EU citizens' rights are guaranteed. And 3, this government must accept that the withdrawal bill as it stands cannot proceed in its current form. So will the Prime Minister live up to these asks, and will she end the moral floundering of EU citizens' rights now?
I'm sure, as the honourable gentleman knows, there will be a meeting next week of the JNC, which brings the devolved administrations together with ministers here in the government. There have been bilateral discussions between the First Secretary of State and ministers in the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government as well on an ongoing basis over the summer. The honourable gentleman refers to citizens' rights. Could I just remind him that during the Scottish independence referendum, which he referred to, which took place in 2014, the First Minister told EU nationals that if the EU did not allow an independent Scotland to rejoin, which was clear they would not do, EU nationals would lose the right to stay here. Now, they now take a completely different... Oh, they shake their heads. They shake their heads, but that was what the First Minister said at the time. And I also say to the honourable gentleman, he references what I said in my statement. Yes, my statement was about the position of the United Kingdom government in the UK's negotiations with the European Union. And Scotland is part of the United Kingdom.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I warmly welcome my right honourable and very good friend, our Prime Minister's statement today on the plans that she has for the negotiations. And can I press her a little bit on this and ask her to elaborate a little bit further? That in the course of her statement she made it clear that the ball was back in the EU's court. Is it not reasonable to expect that, given all of the negotiations and discussions and progress made, that the EU now should engage the United Kingdom on what is beneficial to both them and to us, which is an ongoing free trade arrangement to be done and completed by March 2019.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. And what we see is an increasing interest in actually moving on to talking about that issue, which, as he says, will be absolutely not just in our interest, but in the interests of the European Union. That's what's right for both of us. We want it negotiated by March 2019, so we can take the UK will come out of the European Union, and we know what that new partnership and trade agreement will be.
Ed Miliband. Can I ask the Prime Minister, she has said very clearly that she believes that on her plans we will be out of the customs union and the single market by March 2019. Now, that was not the impression I got from the Florence speech. Could she therefore explain how the arrangements that she is seeking for the transition differ from being members of the single market and the customs union for the period of the transition?
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, as we leave the European Union in March 2019, we will leave the full membership of the customs union and full membership of the single market. What we then want is a period of time when practical changes can be made as we move towards the end state, the trade agreement that we will have agreed with the European Union. We have to negotiate for that implementation period what the arrangements would be. I expect we have suggested that that should be a new agreement, an agreement that we should be able to operate on the same basis and on the same rules and regulations.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend's Florence speech stressed the fundamental principles of UK democracy and accountability in this House, upon which all else depends. The opposition voted against the Withdrawal and Repeal Bill and the repeal of the European Communities Act 1972. Does she agree that our voters have every right to hear a public explanation from the opposition, Remainers and Reversers as to why, despite the referendum vote, they still subscribe under the EU's undemocratic system of lawmaking to a closed-door Council of Ministers where decisions are taken behind closed doors, largely in secrecy, which contrasts so vividly with what goes on in this House with bills, with amendments and with speeches and with votes recorded.
Well, I say to my honourable friend, he's absolutely right to point the finger at the opposition on this particular issue. They claim they're going to support the result of the referendum, yet they vote against the very bill that will put that into place. Not only do they do that, but in voting against the EU withdrawal bill, they have voted against bringing environmental regulations into UK law and bringing workers' rights into UK law. The Labour Party voting against bringing workers' rights into UK law. It's this government that's supporting them.
The Hillary Men. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 4 days ago, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England said that the UK financial services industry needs a transitional deal by Christmas, or else it will begin implementing its contingency plans that the Chancellor is well aware of to shift jobs and activities across the Channel. Telling the House, as the Prime Minister did today, that the ball is now in the EU's court doesn't exactly give those businesses the comfort and certainty that they require. So could the Prime Minister tell the House what her plan now is to break the negotiating logjam and achieve that deal in time for it to do its job for a sector of the economy that employs over 1 million people?
I say to the right honourable gentleman that what the Florence speech did was set out some details on an implementation period and how we think that that could operate. We now wait for the European Union to respond to that detail that we have set out. I recognise the concerns that business have for an implementation period, but I finally would say to the right honourable gentleman that this whole process is not helped by the vast majority of Labour MEPs voting against moving on to the next phase of talks.
John Redwood.
I welcome the Prime Minister's statement that the government will press on with working out the details for no deal. That is a very prudent thing to do, and there will be no cliff edge for British business. And does the Prime Minister agree that it will send a very good message to the European Union that we can do that, but she is offering something so much better and more positive, which is in their interest to accept. But any deal they counter with has to be better than no deal.
Yes, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. I think we've offered a very good arrangement for the future to the European Union. I think it's not only in our interests, I think it's in their interests as well. But as any prudent government would, we continue to make plans for every eventuality. I think that's only the sensible thing for us to do.
Then Bradshaw.
Is it her understanding that, if necessary, it is possible to halt the Article 50 process?
The position was made clear in a case that went through the Supreme Court in relation to the Article 50, and the government made clear that we have no intention of revoking that. We will be delivering on the vote of the British people.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, will my right honourable friend, as she wrestles with the inevitable compromises essential to securing the opportunities of Brexit in the national interest, and in view of this enormous administrative challenge, will she consider refining the machinery of government by creating an inner cabinet to drive forward the work across the government and thus retain greater grip and control over the whole process?
I say to my right honourable friend, we have the government ministers meet in a variety of forms to consider these particular issues. Before the Florence speech, I was pleased that the whole cabinet came together and signed up to that speech. And of course, we have various discussions about the various elements of the negotiations. But I can assure my right honourable friend that what we're aware of is the need to be able to make sure that we can make swift decisions when that is necessary in the negotiating process.
Christopher Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, may I press the Prime Minister to clarify her answer to my right honourable friend, member for Exeter, because he wasn't asking about government policy. He was asking a very straightforward question. Has the government received any legal advice that the Article 50 notice can be revoked?
I have said to the honourable gentleman in response, the position in relation to the revocation of Article 50 was addressed by the Supreme Court in a case that went before it. They were very clear about that. We were clear as a government that we were not revoking, and they were very clear in their consideration of the case of no revocation of Article 50.
Anna Soubry.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Could I congratulate the Prime Minister on her excellent Florence speech? It was widely welcomed, not just by British business, but also by people, I believe, across this country, and it marked a real attempt by our Prime Minister to form the consensus on Brexit between the 48% and the 52% that everybody is crying out for. Can she help me with this? Forgive my throat, Mr. Speaker. Women with bad throats won't be silenced. I may have not heard this properly or understood. But was the Prime Minister saying that at the end of by March 2019, if we haven't got a deal as to the final Brexit arrangements, then we will jump off the cliff and there will be no deal? Or is she saying that we will go into a period of transition and during that time those vital negotiations can continue?
The period after March 2019 is an implementation period to implement the practical changes necessary to move to the final arrangement and the final new partnership that we have with the European Union. So, as the Article 50 process itself sets out, the expectation is that it is a 2-year process to negotiate the arrangements, negotiate withdrawal and take into account and therefore know what the future relationship is going to be. So I expect, and we are working on, having that future arrangement negotiated by the 29th of March 2019. But as I say, because the chances are, that may very well, the details of that may very well come quite late in the process, it won't have been possible for anybody, governments or businesses or individuals, to have made the practical steps necessary to move to that position. And so to get as smooth as possible a withdrawal so that there isn't a cliff edge, we have that period of implementation. And then that moves us to the final arrangement that has been negotiated for by March 2019.
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, further to the question asked by my honourable friend, the member for Nottingham East, which with respect to the Prime Minister was not about the Gina Miller case, but was about government legal advice. Can she tell the House whether the government has received legal advice that Article 50 is revocable?
I'm sorry, I have to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, and perhaps I should have said this to his Right Honourable friend, the member for Exeter, initially, of course, we don't comment on legal advice that's been received, but the position was very clear in that case that the Right Honourable Gentleman has referred to. The Supreme Court were very clear that they operated on the basis that Article 50 would not be revoked.
Mr. Owen Patterson.
A most encouraging statement. Recently in Washington, I found very widespread enthusiasm amongst our American friends at the prospect of signing a free trade deal.
The House is in a very excitable state. I've always enjoyed listening to the Honourable Member for North Shropshire, and I've been doing so for 20 years. I want to continue to do so. Let's hear the Right Honourable Gentleman. He can normally be heard, but the braying and banter was so loud I couldn't hear the fella. Let's hear him. Owen Patterson.
Mr. Speaker, for your benefit, I found widespread enthusiasm right across the American political firmament for the prospect of signing a free trade deal with the United Kingdom. Our American friends will welcome her statement yet again that we will leave the customs union, as that's a prerequisite for signing a deal. Could she give them her best estimate as when, after March 2019, we could actually sign a deal with third countries of a friendly nature like the United States of America?
I echo the comments that my right honourable friend has made? That's exactly what we found in our dealings with the American government, and we have a working group working with the American government on issues relating to trade matters. The issue of the implementation period and the exact arrangements that are there during that implementation period will, of course, be part of the negotiations and a matter for those negotiations, but we're clear that during that implementation period it should be possible for us to continue to negotiate trade agreements, but of course we wouldn't enter into anything which was contrary to the agreement that we had come to with the European Union.
Mr. Chukaramuna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been asked several times about implementation or transition and has not made any sense at all in the answers she has given. She has said today that she foresees a framework for transition of around 2 years along the existing structure of EU rules and regulations. Well, the existing structure has a single market and customs union at its heart. How can what she is proposing for her implementation period be anything other than continued membership of the customs union and the single market, which our companies require?
I'd say to the honourable gentleman, and I thought I had explained it in response to one of his honourable friends, as of 29th of March 2019, we leave the European Union. That means we leave full membership of the customs union, full membership of the single market. We will, as part of that, this is our proposal to the EU, have negotiated an implementation period to take us in a smooth and orderly process so that the practical changes can be made towards the end state, the end agreement that we will have with the European Union. How long that lasts, of course, how long that needs to last, will depend significantly, I'm coming to his point, will depend significantly on the nature of that agreement and how different it is from the current arrangements. But during that period, what we are proposing is that it is in the interests of individuals and businesses for both sides to be able to continue to operate on the same basis as they do today. That would be part of the withdrawal agreement that we propose to negotiate with the European Union. So that negotiation would be about the basis on which we operate during the implementation period.
I was going to call a fellow, but he's beetled out of the curtilage of the chamber, so I can't. But he may beetle back again, but we'll see. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend confirm unequivocally that after the 29th of March 2019, the European Court of Justice's writ will no longer run in any way in this country, and that any new laws that are agreed under the acquis communautaire after that date will not have effect here unless agreed specifically by Parliament?
My honourable friend has actually raised two separate issues, but allied them together. The first is about the European Court of Justice. As I've just said in answer to a number of questions, we want to have a smooth and orderly process of withdrawal with minimum disruption. That's why we want that implementation period, and we have to negotiate what will operate during that implementation period. And yes, that may mean that we will start off with the ECJ still governing the rules we're part of for that period. But what we're also clear of is that we can bring forward discussions and agreements on issues like a dispute resolution mechanism, and if we can bring that forward at an earlier stage, then we would wish to do so. Now, the second issue my honourable friend referred to was the question of new rules that are brought in during that implementation period. Given the way that things operate, it is highly unlikely that anything will be brought forward during that period that hasn't already started discussions through the European Union, to which we are being party of until we leave, and on which we would have been able to say whether they would be a rule that we would sign up to or the rule that we would not wish to sign up to. And any new rules that were put on the table during that implementation period, given, again, the way these things operate, it's highly unlikely they would actually be implemented during that implementation period.
Break.
Speaker, our European friends are looking aghast at the chaos that the Cabinet is creating. The Prime Minister's got to put an end to the backstabbing briefing and counter-briefing from her ministers and their surrogates. Will she show real leadership by ring-fencing the issue of EU citizens' rights, confirming the UK will stay in the customs market and the single market and the customs union, because I'm not aware of anyone who believes the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland can be safe without that? And finally, will she sack the Foreign Secretary, whose leadership whose leadership ambitions blind him to the sustained damage his backseat driving is doing to the UK's negotiating credibility and increasing the risk of us crashing out of the European Union.
It's absolutely right, the right honourable gentleman, that we want to make sure that we get the right resolution for the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. As I've said, we're all clear that we don't want a physical infrastructure on that border, we don't want to return to the hard border, and we don't want to return to the borders of the past. But I'm interested in the approach that the right honourable gentleman is taking. I seem to remember at one stage the Liberal Democrat Party were actively promoting the idea of a referendum on membership of the European Union. Now we've had one, they don't seem to want to accept it.
Mr. Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend simply point out to people who are complaining that these negotiations are going too slowly that after the referendum on the 23rd of June last year, the European refused to negotiate until we had triggered Article 50. But even then, when we had triggered Article 50, they refused to discuss the long-term relationship that they want to have with the United Kingdom. And even after her emollient and conciliatory Florence speech, they are still refusing to discuss the long-term relationship between the EU and the UK. When does she call time?
Oh, shame. Well, can I say to my honourable friend that of course he is right, that it was clear at an early stage that we had to trigger Article 50 before the negotiations started. We waited to do that until we'd done considerable work in government to prepare us for triggering Article 50, which we did, and I think the extent of that work has now been shown in the negotiations and the position papers that we have been publishing over the summer. And on the last point my honourable friend has made, I would simply say this, and I've said it before, that of course there are sometimes public pronouncements made in relation to these negotiations, but we are in a negotiation, and very often what we discuss behind the scenes and what we're able to discuss in private is discussed in a more positive and constructive way than some of the public pronouncements would suggest.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's statement today has been confusing. Can I get to the heart of that confusion? Because she says she wants the benefits of exactly the same terms of trade with the EU as we have now, for which we need regulatory equivalence. She also says we want the benefits of not being bound by EU rules in perpetuity, for which we need regulatory divergence. And it's a simple matter of logic that equivalence is the opposite of divergence. The Prime Minister is proposing that we want a thing and the opposite of that thing. How will she resolve this obvious contradiction?
When you enter into a trade agreement with another country, you both sides agree the set of rules and regulations that will pertain to that trade agreement. But they also agree how any disputes about that will be resolved and what will happen if either side chooses to change, to diverge those, from those the rules and regulations in those trade agreements. That is the position that we will be doing with the European Union, negotiating a trade agreement, but we already operate on the same basis of the same rules and regulations. The EU withdrawal bill brings the EU acquis into UK law, so the key question is how we manage divergence on either side after that. That will be part of the negotiations. It's the same as you do in any trade agreement.
Mr. Christopher Chu.
Does my right honourable friend believe that the European Union genuinely wants a dynamic and creative future trade relationship with the United Kingdom in accordance with her vision? And if so, where is the evidence for it?
Well, can I just say to my honourable friend that, yes, I believe, first of all, that sort of relationship is in the interests of the member states of the remaining 27 member states of the European Union. And I also believe that as they are coming to look at this issue, which is one that I think they haven't focused on previously, but Florence has now triggered their thinking on this issue, they will see the benefits that such a relationship will bring not just to us but to them as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The EU Commission continually talks about Her Majesty's government giving certainty and clarity. Isn't there one area that we could give that certainty and clarity very clearly today and in our negotiations, that on March 2019 all our fisheries, we withdraw from the common fisheries policy, we take back our fisheries, and that we make sure our fishing communities actually take back control of who fishes in British waters?
Well, the the honourable lady is very right in suggesting that, of course, when we leave the European Union, one of the aspects of leaving the European Union will be leaving the common fisheries policy. Now, of course, we will need to consider the arrangements that we want to put in place here in the United Kingdom for the operation of our coastal waters and the operation of fishing around them.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you. May I thank the Prime Minister for the very positive tone at the Florence speech and the constructive meeting since. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is in the interests of consumers on both sides of the Channel that we do have a deep and special and bespoke partnership that covers goods and services? And in this regard, I'm particularly thinking about the hundreds and thousands of German consumers who have bought life insurance products from British insurance companies and who will find that unless there is agreement, their pension plan savings are lost.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, which is often people look at this issue as thinking that it's only UK businesses and UK individuals that will be affected, but actually it's people living in the remaining 27 countries of the European Union who will also be affected, which is why, precisely why, I think the sort of deep and special partnership she refers to is in the interests of both sides.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, the shambles and division on the front bench would be funny if there weren't such serious consequences for our economy, for our jobs and for the future of this country and the world. And the Prime Minister is simply not being honest on a whole series of consequences for this country. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. She's not being transparent, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. She's not being transparent with the public about the consequences for our economy. Will she say how much money has she put aside to deal with a disastrous no deal? And secondly, will she publish the economic assessments that have been made by the Secretary of State sitting next to his department onto the impact on 50 sectors in our economy?
Shall I say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about the position of the government. The position of the government is very clear. It's been set out in the Florence speech. It's an offer to the European Union, and we await discussions with them on that particular issue. I've also been clear, as I was from Lancaster House onwards, that where it is possible for us to give information and to update on the negotiations, we will do so. But we will do nothing which will undermine our position in the negotiations.
James Duddridge.
Mr. Speaker, given Germany and France export more to us than we export to them, what discussions has she had with her French and German counterparts, getting them to pressurise the EU institutions to get a good deal for France and Germany, which means negotiating faster, more effectively, getting shared understanding of what we can both gain from this deal?
I assure my honourable friend that I do have discussions with the leaders of France and Germany, and indeed of other member states within the European Union, because there are others that also have a significant economic interest in our future relationship, such as the Dutch and the Belgians for the economic activity at their ports. And we discuss with them the arrangements for the future, and I think, as I said a little earlier, there is a growing sense and recognition of the importance of having that deep and special trading relationship for the future for both sides.
Catherine West.
The Prime Minister please tell the House the cost of Brexit to the public purse in A, where there is a deal, and B, where there is no deal?
Doesn't know.
I have to say to the honourable lady, of course, it's not possible to answer that question until we know that we are negotiating a deal. We will not have negotiated that deal until, I suspect, close to the end of the period in which it has been set aside for it. And at that point, we'll be able to see what the benefits of that deal will be for the future of the British economy.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister on her detailed statement, which was in stark contrast to the Leader of the Opposition, who left the House completely in the dark as to his own position. Can she solve a dilemma for me? Why, if the Labour Party are so concerned about Brexit, or even indeed for the security of EU nationals after we leave, could they not bring themselves to debate this matter at all at their own party conference in Brighton?
I have to say, I think my honourable friend has made a very good point. At the Labour Party conference, they actually refused to have a full debate on the issue they now say matters of such consequence to them. But then that's typical. They take one position on a Tuesday and the next position on a Wednesday.
Chris Bryant.
We did debate the European Union and Brexit at our conference, actually. But let me ask a different matter. Because of our membership of the European Union, there are some 200,000 Britons living in Catalonia. And there's roughly the same number of Catalan Spaniards living in the UK. Now, I don't think anybody in this House supports the police brutality that we've seen in Spain, but the French government has been absolutely clear that if Catalonia tries to declare itself independent unilaterally, it will not recognise Catalonia. Will the Prime Minister today make that same guarantee for Britain?
I say to the honourable gentleman, none of us want to see the sort of violence and scenes that we saw on the streets of Catalonia. I want to see, and I'm sure all honourable members do, want to see this situation being resolved peacefully. But we are very clear as a government that the Spanish government has the right to uphold the Spanish constitution, and also that all parties should be operating under the rule of law.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Speaker, I very much support the Prime Minister in the final destination that she set out again today. But I have to say that the speech in Florence seemed like a reward for the EU's intransigence. Can she confirm that we buy around £70 billion more goods and services from the EU than they buy from us each year, and that when we leave the EU, we will be their single biggest export market? So given that, can she confirm that there will be no more rewards for the EU's intransigence?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that he's right, of course, that the trading relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU is very important to the European Union, as well as being important to us in the UK. What I did in my Florence speech was set out a vision, set out a proposal for the future relationship between the two countries based on the current relationship that we have, and showing how we can develop that relationship in a way that is in the interests of both sides. This has changed the dial, has switched the dial in relation to the negotiations that we're having, and obviously we look forward to being able to enter those negotiations on these aspects in more detail.
Seema Malhotra.
Mr. Speaker, on the first page of the Prime Minister's statement, she says that she proposes a unique and ambitious economic partnership with the EU. If she is confident that the new unique and ambitious economic partnership she envisaged will be better for the UK economy than our current quite ambitious economic partnership and membership of the single market and customs union, then further to the question from my honourable friend, the member for Cardiff South and Penarth, why won't she, alongside her white papers, finally today publish the list of the sectors of the economy that she has undertaken an impact assessment, and publish also the results of those assessments so that the public can have the information about the impact of Brexit on the economy?
Question. The full list of sectors will be published shortly.
Sir Hugo Swire.
Mr. Speaker, following the recent German elections, power has moved from Berlin to Paris. So will she remind President Macron the importance of being a good neighbour to the United Kingdom, as post-Brexit they will still be our neighbour? Tens of thousands of French people will still want to come here, visit here and study here, and vice versa. That we will still wish to cooperate on environmental issues and immigration, and that we will still wish to preserve our special defence arrangements with the French.
My honourable friend has made an important point about our future, not just our future relationship with the European Union, but our future bilateral relationship with France. And I can assure him that the discussions that I have with President Macron, that other ministers have with their opposite numbers, are all based on us not just maintaining but enhancing that future bilateral relationship.
Paul Flynn.
Does the two crippling tariffs imposed by her American friends on the British Bombardier jobs prove the jobs hell that Brexit or a no deal will create?
That, of course, the judgment that came out of the American Department of Commerce is a preliminary judgment. We await the final judgment of that department, and of course that can then go to the issue can then go to a trade commissioner. We continue to work with the US government, the Canadian government, and with Boeing and Bombardier to bring about a resolution to this dispute to protect the important jobs in Northern Ireland. And I understand my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will be making a statement on this tomorrow.
George Freeman.
After the funfair of the conference season, can I welcome the Prime Minister back in her place as leader of this party, this government and this country to the serious business of government, and congratulate her on the steely determination she showed last week, including setting out a rather inspiring commitment to see this through on behalf of the next generation. Could I ask the Prime Minister, when she heard the Leader of the Opposition refer to Labour's policy of a transition phase, did she, like me, think that that must be the one that the Prime Minister announced in her Lancaster House speech? The only transition I see is a transition from a once great Labour Party to a party of Venezuelan socialism.
Well, I think my honourable friend has it absolutely spot on both counts, and indeed, in my Lancaster House speech, I said I want us to have reached an agreement about our future partnership by the time the two-year Article 50 process has concluded. From that point onwards, we believe a phased process of implementation to enable us to prepare for the new arrangements will be in our mutual self-interest. So, indeed, we thought of the implementation period quite a long time ago.
Anne Clwyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that I've asked the Prime Minister 3 times in this chamber the same question, given the importance of the European Parliament in the negotiations, last time I asked her, when will she address the plenary of the European Parliament? When will she do it?
I thank the Honourable Lady, and she has, and I have spoken to the President of the European Parliament about my going over there and speaking with either the plenary or indeed the Council of Presidents of the European Parliament, and I believe our offices are negotiating on a date at the moment.
Ah, yes, Mr. James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure members on both sides of the House can confirm that listening to senior Danish politicians is a very good idea. Would my right honourable friend recommend the other leaders of EU 27 countries listen to the wise counsel of the Danish Foreign Minister, who suggests that they stop playing games and move now on to negotiating our future trade arrangements?
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend, and of course that reaffirms the point that I was making earlier, that there are many in the European Union who do believe the time is now right to move on to that discussion of trade negotiation.
Mr. Stephen Kinnock.
A perfect segue, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't do it in Danish, not today. The Prime Minister's commitment to a transition deal was a welcome reality check in this whole process. But the European Parliament resolution of the 3rd of October states that a transition period can only happen on the basis of the existing EU regulatory, budgetary, supervisory, judiciary and enforcement instruments. Does the Prime Minister agree with the terms of that resolution?
That is the view of the European Parliament and the resolution that they took. I've put out in my statement and indeed in my Florence speech that we expect that the implementation period will be based on the current rules and regulations, but of course this is part of the negotiation.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Sir, in order to negotiate an outcome consistent with the ambition that she set out, isn't it absolutely essential that we invest in preparations against the possibility of no agreement at all?
Yes, I can absolutely agree with my honourable friend on that, and that's precisely why that's exactly what the government is doing.
I'm sure the Prime Minister knows that the Supreme Court did not opine on the question as to whether or not Article 50 was revocable, because the question in front of them was about our involvement. So why, when asked about this by my right honourable friend for Exeter, about what advice she's had recently, has she relied on the Supreme Court?
The point that I made in relation to the Supreme Court is that the Court proceeded on the basis that Article 50 would not be revoked, and I gave the answer to one other of her honourable friends about what government does or does not say about legal advice.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister for the tone she has set in the run-up to the decision of the October Council? But can I also thank her for the reply she's just given to my right honourable friend for New Forest West? making clear that the government has followed the recommendations of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in its March report about the need to prepare no deal? And will she confirm that individuals and businesses are also going to need to be in a position to make their own contingency plans, and if these negotiations are postponed for at least 2 months on the final settlement in October, does she accept that the government is then going to have to surface its no-deal preparations so that businesses and individuals can share in making the necessary preparations? Because this is going to rely also on a vote of the European Parliament, and we saw what happened last week with the Labour MEPs supporting a position absolutely against the interests of the United Kingdom.
Can I say to my honourable friend that, first of all, obviously, I still expect that we will be able to negotiate a good deal, and that's what we are working for. And it is, of course, important that we take businesses along with us, and we discuss and hear from businesses their reaction to the various issues that are being raised in the negotiations. Indeed, I and a number of other Cabinet Ministers were present at the Business Advisory Council that we held in number 10 Downing Street today. But my honourable friend's question seemed to be based on the premise that if we hadn't got a formal notification of sufficient progress in October, then it meant we weren't likely to get a deal. I don't believe that that is the case. I believe, as has been indicated by other honourable friends, that actually we are seeing more of a movement on the European Union side to recognise the importance of discussing the trade negotiations and to be considering the necessity of an implementation period.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by commending the Prime Minister warmly for keeping going at our conference speech. It couldn't have been easy. The Prime Minister will be well aware, and I'm sure other members of the House will be well aware, that the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 was voted on by thousands and thousands of people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and had a majority in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I'm very pleased today that the Prime Minister has said that we owe it to the people of Northern Ireland and to the people of the Republic of Ireland to get it right, to get Brexit right. So would the Prime Minister please look very seriously at introducing a government amendment to the EU withdrawal bill, which guarantees on the face of that legislation that no regulations made under that bill will repeal or amend the Good Friday Agreement. I think that would be very helpful to people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that both this government and the Irish government, and indeed increasingly in the discussions we've been having with them on the issues relating to Northern Ireland and the Republic, the European Union have confirmed an absolute commitment to the Good Friday Agreement. We're very clear that we stand by the Good Friday Agreement, and which, as she says, was hard negotiated and was obviously welcomed, as she says, by a majority. We absolutely committed to ensuring that nothing that we do in the Brexit negotiations in any way jeopardises the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement.
Mr. Sharishvara.
Speaker, may I first of all congratulate the Prime Minister on her very encouraging and positive statement. Would she agree with me that it would be helpful if British businesses with interests in other European Union countries were to use their influence with the political leadership in those countries to impress upon them the need to have an agreement in everyone's interest? In particular, would she agree that they need to emphasise that the economic impact for not having an agreement by March 2019 will not only be affecting Britain, but hugely to the other EU countries as well?
My honourable friend has made a very important point, and I certainly would encourage businesses and others to ensure that they are making that clear with their contacts in the 27 member states. Indeed, I believe that is already happening, and I certainly meet people from across the European Union who make exactly this point, that it is in their economic interests to ensure that we get a good deal negotiated by March 2019.
Chris Ruane.
Over the past 17 years, Wales has received £9,000 million in grants from Europe. During the Brexit debates and the referendum, Tory ministers said that Wales would not lose out as a result of Brexit. Can the Prime Minister tell us how much funding Wales will get, additional funding Wales will get after Brexit is completed?
Nice bid, as the exiting the EU Secretary of State says. Can I say to the honourable gentleman, well, the honourable gentleman changed from not losing out to additional money in his question. Can I say we've been very clear? We've been very clear in relation to a number of elements where people currently receive funding that is related to the European Union, such as in the Common Agricultural Policy and structural funds, that we will meet any agreements that are entered into before we leave the European Union on the structural funds issue in relation to those, as long as they meet UK priorities and indeed our value for money. Thereafter, once we are outside the European Union, it will be for us here in the UK to decide how we wish to ensure that different parts of the country are supported in the way that's necessary for them. What I have put forward is that there should be a shared prosperity fund that will look at the diversity and disparity within regions and between regions and will act accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with a leading UK industrialist and we discussed about Brexit. They employ hundreds of thousands of people in this country, and whilst he wanted to see an agreement and understand it entirely the Prime Minister's implementation period, he was concerned if there was no agreement. It's no good saying that on the 29th of March. He needs to know what Brexit without a deal would look like now, so he can plan for that eventuality. And he asked, could the Prime Minister publish those plans prior to Christmas?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I recognise the concerns that people have to ensure that they know what the situation is going to be in the future. The government is preparing, is working on what steps will be necessary for whatever the eventuality, whether we do negotiate a deal or whether we don't negotiate a deal. And in doing that, we are holding discussions with business.
Howell Williams.
Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for prior sensible statements. We've heard a great deal from her about the non-border that she envisages between the north of Ireland and the Republic, but I don't think a word about the border between Wales and the Republic of Ireland, though the North Wales route through Holyhead is second only, I think, to Dover in terms of the volume of traffic. Can she tell the House what she's doing to ensure that North Wales doesn't grind to a halt after Brexit?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I'm very clear that as we look for a solution for the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, we don't want to set up a new border between the island of Ireland and the mainland of the United Kingdom. Obviously, the relationship, what happens at the border that he's referenced, will depend on the future partnership that we agree with the European Union. We've put some proposals forward for customs arrangements that could pertain. When we get into the negotiation of that phase, we'll be able to look at those issues in detail.
Michelle Donnellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister confirm that we will rule out a second referendum, unlike the party opposite, who seem to be rather confused as to whether we should be speeding up the process or actually reversing it?
My honourable friend makes a very, very important point. I'm very clear there will be no second referendum. The British people were given their opportunity to choose. They chose to come out of the European Union, and that's what this government will deliver.
Honourable friend, that it is the modus operandi of the European Union to bully on occasion, to negatively brief the media on occasion, and also to bide for time right up until the wire. So can I tell my right honourable friend not to be naive, not that she would be, and listen to the ridiculous comments from the party opposite, who've never negotiated their way out of a paper bag, let alone with the European Union.
I have to say to my honourable friend, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We know the things that can be done in negotiations to appear to make life difficult. What matters is that this government has its vision very clearly set on the end state and the arrangement that we wish to negotiate, and we are firmly committed to that negotiation. And I can think of no better person than my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, to deal with the sort of methods that my honourable friend has set out.
Mr. David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the major issue here the fact that the government's Brexit agenda is being driven by the Foreign Secretary on the pages of the Daily Telegraph? That's whilst he's not moonlighting as Bernard Manning. Therefore, can I ask the Prime Minister, will she listen to the Scottish Government and not sacrifice 80,000 jobs by leaving the single market purely on the altar of internal party politics?
I know I've explained this on a number of occasions, but I will do so again. The British people voted to leave the European Union. Leaving the European Union means not being a full member of the single market and a full member of the customs union. What we have set out is a proposal for a deep and special economic partnership with the European Union, which continues to enable us, both sides, to trade with each other in a way which protects jobs and brings increasing prosperity to the United Kingdom and to the European Union. And if I will say again, as I've said in the past, if the honourable gentleman wants to ensure that jobs in Scotland are protected, he needs to make sure that Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom.
Mr. Andrew Rosindell.
Mr. Speaker, the very last thing my constituents would want is to revoke Article 50. The British people voted for it, and they expect the Prime Minister to deliver, and have every confidence that she will. But will she reassure the people of Gibraltar that no agreement will be made unless they are fully included in that agreement, and that Spain has no veto over their future?
We're very clear on that, and we have been continuing to hold talks with the Gibraltar government to make sure that they are fully aware of the negotiations as those negotiations go along, as indeed we have with others. We're very clear about the position of Gibraltar, and my honourable friend makes a very important point about the Labour Party and the opposition in this House today. They claim that they want to respect the vote of the referendum, that here they are trying to suggest that we should be revoking Article 50. That's the exact opposite of what the British people wanted.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, if I can say to the honourable member for Lichfield, as a lifelong negotiator who stood up for workers all my life against the actions of his government, the jewel in the crown of British manufacturing is the automotive sector. A world-class success story that has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers, and over half our cars are sold into the European Union. Can the Prime Minister provide more detail on the period of implementation, because the industry is facing mounting problems?
Yes, please.
In particular, given the importance of regulatory alignment to the sector and the integrated nature of European supply chains. If the government gets this wrong, it will do grave damage to the automotive sector, and thousands of workers will pay the price with their jobs.
I can say to the honourable gentleman that I recognise the importance of the automotive industry here in the United Kingdom. There are a number of other industries here in the United Kingdom that are very important for jobs and very important for our future prosperity. We have set out the framework for the implementation period. I've been clear, as I was in the Florence speech, in relation to the rules and regulations during that implementation period. But of course it has to be negotiated with the European Union, and that's exactly what we want to start to do.
Order. I'm keen to accommodate remaining colleagues. However, although we've been blessed with commendably succinct replies by the Prime Minister, some questions have equalled, in terms of their length, the eloquence with which they've been expressed. So there's a premium on brevity. Mr. Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Businesses in my constituency are concerned about the outcomes, particularly of frictionless movements of goods across Europe and mutual recognition of standards, rather than membership of particular institutions. Will the Prime Minister reassure me that during the second phase of negotiations, those outcomes will be the government's priority?
Yes, I can give my honourable friend that assurance. That's exactly why we have set out that we want to negotiate a new agreement, a new partnership with the European Union, and it will be the interests of businesses across the United Kingdom that will be part of what is driving us towards that new arrangement.
Paul Girvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Prime Minister, in the statement to the House today. I listened with interest to your speech where you stated you were a proud unionist and strong on the union. I take heart from that. I want to give comfort to the people of Northern Ireland in relation to not having a soft border or a hard border down the middle of the Irish Sea, where the people of Ulster feel that they are being set on the sideline? I would like that assurance. Thank you, Prime Minister.
I'm very happy to give that assurance that we don't want to see a border down the Irish Sea either. We want to maintain the integrity of the internal market of the United Kingdom.
Mr. Richard Graham.
The Speaker, former New Zealand High Commissioner Lockwood Smith has said that there are few advantages to the UK in leaving the EU without bringing back ambitious responsibility for our own trading arrangements across the world. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that while we're all agreed across this House on the importance of a short-term period of transition, we shouldn't lose sight of the longer-term goal of pursuing our own trade deals?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. I believe there are real opportunities for the UK in negotiating those other trade agreements around the world, and while we will have that implementation period, we will be negotiating and ensuring that we can put into place trade agreements that will be of benefit to this country and benefit to jobs in this country.
Dr. Rupa Haq.
Mr. Speaker, the writing is not on the wall for this government, as some say. It's just slowly sliding off. So why was it that the Prime Minister chose to deliver this statement from Florence when Ealing Town Hall would have had her? Yes. And what was the cost of flying the entire cabinet there in pounds, euros or carbon footprint? Any will do.
I'm asked why I give a speech about our future relationship with Europe on mainland Europe. I don't think that there needs to be any answer to that.
Mr. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm whether her concept of an implementation phase is one which would only be enacted if firm plans and a schedule for implementation of permanent new arrangements between the EU and UK have already been agreed?
Yes, and it's very simple. Implementation is a practical period for practical changes to be put in place. You can't know what those practical changes are until you know what the end state is you're driving towards. So I see it very much as having agreed what that end state and that future relationship is. That period of implementation is purely to put the practicalities in place.
Tan Singh Desi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within these important plans for leaving the EU, could the Prime Minister please confirm whether safeguards have been put in place to ensure that the promised £350 million will be made available for our NHS?
One of the reasons why people voted to leave the EU is, as I said earlier, to take control of our money, so we won't be sending huge sums of money every year in perpetuity to the European Union. And of course, when we have left the European Union, we'll be able to decide how any funds that are available are deployed among as a matter of decision by this government.
Mr. Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister both upon her statement and the Florence speech and its tone of pragmatism? Does she agree with me that throughout this time and the implementation period, it will be right and proper to place our commercial interests front and centre in these matters, regardless of any arcane or theoretical considerations, and that patience and pragmatism is not only important in the interest of this country, but actually is most consistent with the spirit of our party too?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right in the emphasis that he puts on patience and pragmatism. I think that's exactly the spirit in which we're entering these negotiations. He's right that we have to consider fairly and squarely the commercial interests. We also have to ensure that the deal that we bring forward at the end of the day is a deal that is clearly in the United Kingdom's national interest.
Ambos Charalambos.
In her statement, the Prime Minister referred to a post-Brexit United Kingdom as being an independent trading nation. Can she explain how this will apply to just-in-time manufacturing in the United Kingdom?
Well, I have to say, the independent trading nation is a nation that is able to determine its own trading policy and is able to enter into trade agreements around the rest of the world. Of course, what he's talking about is something that depends on having frictionless borders, and as I've said, we want to negotiate with the European Union as frictionless a border as possible.
Mr. Kevin Hollin-Rake.
Mr. Speaker, it's good to hear the Prime Minister's optimism in terms of the chances of striking a trade deal, but also that we're preparing for no deal. In order to give business as much time as possible to adjust, would she consider drawing a line in the sand with a date attached to it by which if we haven't made sufficient progress,
we will finally and simply walk away from the negotiating table.
I have to say to my honourable friend that I think one of the points about negotiation is that it's important that we keep our hand free as possible in those negotiations. We do want to ensure that we, as we take business with us, and I said there are a number of ways in which we're discussing the future arrangements with business. The implementation period, I think, is important for business, and I hope that we can get on to discuss that as early as possible with the European Union. But I think we do need to maintain a degree of flexibility in our negotiating positions.
Mr. Graham Stringer. The European Commission, by having not yet sat down to talk about trade, has shown that its priorities are the integrationist European project and punishing this country for having the temerity to choose to govern ourselves. This doesn't bode well for any deal. Can the Prime Minister tell us what balance of resources she is putting into contingencies for if there is no deal compared to the amount of resources going into the negotiations?
We're doing the work that is necessary in order to be able to ensure that we are prepared for whatever outcome comes out of the negotiations. The honourable gentleman is right. Obviously, there have been a number of speeches that have recent times that suggest a more integrationist approach for the European Union in future. I'm very clear that it's important that we are that self-governing nation and that we get that good deal with the European Union, because I think it's in both sides' economic interests.
Sir Nigel Huddleston.
Speaker, given that the EU has a £70 billion annual trade surplus with the UK, does the Prime Minister agree that the European business community ought to be far more vocal in their communications with their political leaders, because failure to conclude a deal would not reflect well on their competence?
My honourable friend is right that I think it's important for businesses based in the European Union that they do see that we come to a good trade agreement and good new economic partnership with the European Union. I would encourage them to make that point.
Mark Henry.
Would the Prime Minister care to comment on the remarks of John Bruton, who has said that the EU can't really trust the UK because of the huge divisions within her government? And is this the impression that we're giving our European partners?
No, the European Union are very clear that the position of this government was set out in the Florence speech.
Mr. Speaker, at times like this, it's important that Britain speaks with one voice. Well, the opposition may laugh, but if that's the case, would my right honourable friend agree with me that it was deeply disappointing that British MEPs voted against a furthering of the negotiations, taking them to the crucial stage, and was she as surprised as I was that she was the only party leader to withdraw the whip from these individuals?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It is in the interest of this country that we move forward on those trade negotiations. I was astounded to hear that any MEPs had voted against, had voted in favour of a resolution saying that sufficient progress had not been made and we should not move to those trade negotiations. I've acted for the two Conservative MEPs who voted, I think, against British interests. It's time the right honourable gentleman did something about the 18 Labour MEPs who did so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the transitional period for businesses to adjust, as will businesses in my constituency and port authorities. On 3 occasions she's mentioned the Irish border with Welsh, Scottish and English ports. Can she be clear with me? Because I have read the paper this summer, I have read the House of Lords report and what the EU have said. Will there be a special customs union between Wales, Scotland, Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? And can she categorically say there'll be no physical borders in Welsh ports?
Well, the situation we are in relation to the customer, I've referenced the paper, and she says he read this. He read this summer. That set out a couple of options for the customs relationship overall between the UK and the EU once we've left the European Union. Of course, we need to get into these negotiations so we can sit down with the European Union and discuss with them what is going to work for both sides. But I repeat what I have said, that we want to maintain the integrity of the internal market of the United Kingdom, and we also are very clear that there should be no physical infrastructure on the border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Mr. David Morris.
Mr. Speaker, my local Chamber of Commerce welcomed the 2-year transition period because business is quite simply booming in my constituency. They actually get that. They also get that if there's a run on the pound like the opposition say there's going to be, if they ever reach government, it's going to create
not just job losses, but interest rate increases. But, Mr Speaker, if I'm going to criticise my Prime Minister, it has to be on this statement. Not what's in it, but the font of it. My ailing eyes can't see this, so in future, Prime Minister, please put it in large print, not just for my ailing eyes, so that the Leader of the Opposition and his front bench can understand it.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that suggestion. I will certainly give very careful thought to it, and I'm sure businesses in his constituency are thriving and recognise the value that is brought to them by having such a good constituency Member of Parliament.
Kate Green.
The Prime Minister says that she wants a unique trading relationship with the EU after Brexit, so she'll be pleased to know that the Citizens' Assembly convened last month by the Constitution Unit at University College London reached the same conclusion. However, the members of the Assembly also said that if a bespoke deal was not possible, the next best thing would be for us to remain in the customs union and single market. Can I invite the Prime Minister to look at that piece of work, deliberatively arrived at and with a 3-to-1 majority among Leave and Remain voters for retaining those options if a deal cannot be achieved?
Well, we're always happy to look at any contributions that are made to the debate around these negotiations, but I repeat for the Honourable Lady that the point is that the European Union has been very clear about the indivisibility of the 4 pillars, that actually if you want to be a full member of the single market and a full member of the customs union, it means maintaining free movement, maintaining the overall jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is effectively not leaving the European Union. The British people voted to leave the European Union.
Tomlinson.
Mr Speaker, I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and in particular her comments about EU citizens and, equally importantly, UK citizens living and working in the EU. But she's right, the ball is very much in the EU's court. But will she ensure that this issue remains front and centre and is resolved as quickly as possible?
Yes, I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that confirmation and reassurance. We said we wanted this to be looked at an early stage. It has been looked at an early stage. Significant progress has been made, and I hope that the negotiators will be able to clear up the remaining issues between us in relation to citizens' rights, so we can give that absolute certainty to citizens.
Mr Stephen Timms.
Will the Prime Minister confirm what I think is the implication of what she's been saying about the implementation period of around 2 years, that there won't be any new restrictions at the UK border for EU citizens wishing to come into the UK during that period? She said there'll be a registration scheme. Who will she require to register?
And how much will it...
It's right that people will be able to come to live and work in the United Kingdom, but those coming from the European Union after the point at which we have left the European Union will be required to register. This is part of the building block to the new immigration rules which will be in place at the end of that implementation period.
Alex Chalk.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Constituents of mine at GCHQ play an expert and invaluable role in the defence of both this nation and the continent of Europe. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the unconditional guarantee of ongoing intelligence cooperation is a constructive step which should help pave the way to early trade talks?
Yes, I would hope that actually the European Union would recognise the benefit of the security relationship we have with them, and the relationship we have on matters of counter-terrorism, but also on law enforcement and criminal justice more widely. I think actually that relationship is in both our interests, but I hope they recognise the importance of it.
Diana Johnson.
Can the Prime Minister just say which particular elements of full membership of the single market she thinks should not apply in any transitional arrangements?
As I have said, if you are a full member of the single market, that is indivisible from full membership of the customs union, from free movement and from the complete jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. What we will be doing is negotiating an implementation period and negotiating the arrangements on which we are able to operate, and negotiating those as a body, as a country that will no longer be a member of the European Union.
Liz McInnes.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has said that her position on Gibraltar is clear, but if that's the case, can she explain why she made no reference to Gibraltar in her statement?
Oh, yes.
And can she clarify what conversations she's had with the Spanish government about the Gibraltar-Spain border?
Yeah.
we're very clear that the issue of borders and relationships is one that we wish to discuss as part of the overall relationship for the future between the United Kingdom and the European Union. But as I said earlier, we have been continuing to discuss with the Government of Gibraltar their particular concerns and interests to ensure that we're able to provide a deal which works for Gibraltar as well as the United Kingdom.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister not agree with me that in the haste to seize control of laws, borders and money, no consideration has been given to what end that is best achieved within the British state itself? And would it not be most satisfactory to convene a constitutional convention that would properly consider how the distribution of legislative and regulatory governance across the UK is achieved through each component part of the United Kingdom, including England itself?
Well, I have to say to the Honourable Gentleman, we're doing a very simple thing. We are putting into place the wishes of the British people as expressed in a referendum, and we are negotiating towards that future deal. But I suggest he talks to his right honourable friend, the leader of his party. The leader of his party was complaining that we're being slow in this, and he says we're being too hasty.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister seems to have failed to notice that the vote in the European Parliament was 557 votes to 92, a clear rejection of the government's chaotic strategy, confusing for everyone, most of all deeply damaging for business confidence and future investments. So when will we hear exactly when those transition arrangements will be in place, because businesses need to know now?
I have, as I said in my implied in my statement, as I've said in answers to questions, we have put forward a proposal for the implementation period, but this is a negotiation. So it means that we need to negotiate the details of that implementation period with the European Union. And the European Parliament gave that view. That isn't a binding vote from the European Parliament, but I have to say that if the Honourable Lady wants us to get on to negotiate about that implementation period, then she should have suggested to her 18 Labour MEPs that they voted against that resolution and not in favour.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I gently remind the Prime Minister that if she wants to make a habit of suspending Conservative parliamentarians who act against the British interest, she really doesn't have to go as far as Brussels to find some prime candidates. But given her often professed concern for the fate of UK nationals living in the European Union, how does she feel about the fact that on the 12th of September, when Westminster Hall gave us an opportunity to debate that precise matter, there wasn't a single Conservative backbencher who saw fit to remain for the entire 90 minutes of that debate? Does that not speak volumes for the real degree of lack of concern that her party has got for the 1.5 million Brits overseas and for the 3 million Europeans living here?
Can I say to the Honourable Gentleman, you can't have it always. On one hand, the Scottish Nationalist Party complained to me that I'm not making unilateral declarations about EU citizens here, and my point is very clear, that we have the interests of UK citizens in hand as well, and we want to consider that interest. We are working on that. We're ensuring actively through the negotiations the interests of those UK citizens. It's not about standing up and talking about it, it's about doing something about it.